And hello YouTube, this is Thomas Judge back once again with another YouTube reading guide series. Today's not so much a series as it is a one-off guide or overview of what I'd like to call the Millerverse. That is to say, the comics set in the Dark Knight Returns universe created by Frank Miller. Now, this video is kind of in response to a request from a viewer. I did mention in my DC Year One's guide, which is a 7-part guide series on my channel, that I could make this Millerverse video if anyone wanted it. And someone reached out to ask for it, and I'm more than happy to oblige. To be honest, I thought it'd be quite an easy, quick one. I thought, yeah, I read most of the Miller comics, I can just throw that together and do a Dark Knight overview. However, that wasn't the case. That's because I wanted to do it properly, and it not only took much longer than I thought, because I had assumed it was going to be around 36 issues that I'd read, and in fact it ended up being around 122 issues. But as well as that, it was a really interesting experience because it actually taught me quite a lot and helped me improve the way that I collect and organize my comic collection. Not least of all, it helped me realize that the idea of a Millerverse is actually quite limited and unhelpful. But we'll talk about that more later on in this video. Firstly, to begin with, we need to establish that the issues I'm talking about in this video are the ones published by DC Comics, and we need to agree on what is meant when I say that they form part of the Millerverse continuity. Now, to start with, I'm focusing explicitly on comics created or co-created by Frank Miller here. But I will be touching on other series that many people consider to be part of the same continuity in a separate video, which will be sort of a follow-up or a sequel to this video. Now, I personally don't consider stories by other writers to be part of the Millerverse in the same way, and we will discuss that before the end of the video to distinguish between the idea of a Millerverse or a Dark Knight Returns universe, and hopefully that'll be really useful to you in your own reading. It's also worth noting that ever since Flashpoint and the New 52, which established the event 0 year as being the origin year of Batman's first year of operation, that all the Miller stories are no longer in DC continuity, technically. I know things have changed with Infinite Frontier and things more recently, but I don't want to get tangled up in all that. Instead, what we can generally consider is that these all form part of what is called the Dark Knight universe or Millerverse. And again, we'll split those two terms out more carefully before the end of the video. Now, some DC literature does refer to the Millerverse as being Earth 31. If you want a better understanding of how the DC multiverse is structured, please check out my multiverse guide from my Vocabulary of Comics playlist. But in a nutshell, there are 52 Earths or realities or continuities in the DC universe. And again, I generally disagree with the use of those labels. I especially disagree with the use of the label Earth 31. The reason for that is as much information exists that contradicts this numbering as supports it. And given that DC's numbering system for its multiverse is much less rigorous and stable than Marvel's, I personally don't slavishly adhere to it. Let's be accurate about this. The designation Earth 31 was actually provided by a writer called Keith Champagne and was introduced as such in the 2007 weekly limited series Countdown Arena. Now, Countdown Arena is part of an event that I have not yet, and in fact may never, have a guide for on my channel. But the important thing is that Champagne said that the Superman of Earth 31 featured in that series is the Superman that appeared in Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns. Now, I don't know how true that is, or how much DC editorial agree with this random claim, but I do know that in the tail end of the New 52 era, so around 2016, Grant Morrison wrote The Multiversity. This contained loads of information on the DC multiverse of 52 realities, and as you can see here, the world of Earth 31 is explicitly shown as not being that of Frank Miller's Batman. What does this tell us? Well, it tells me to ignore DC's numbering system for its multiverse, at least in the most part, and just to carry on regardless. Unlike Marvel, whose numbering system is very, very good indeed and is an excellent way to navigate their universe, the DC one is often a red herring at best. Next, I'm also, in this video and the next video, in fact, I'm not going to be covering every single obsessive appearance of the Dark Knight Returns Batman being in a random panel here or a background panel there in that issue, because that would mean including things like the Planetary Batman one-shot or even some random zero-hour issues from the mid-90s. I'm not interested in doing that, as it's not in keeping with the narrative experience of reading a comic universe, in this case the Millerverse. If you're a Type P reader, which is a term I explain elsewhere, then best of luck to you. Feel free to do that. However, please don't comment on this video with points like Miller's version of the Dark Knight was in a background panel of issue X or issue Y. That's not the sort of guide this is. And if that's the sort of guide that you want, you need to go elsewhere to somewhere like Reddit. Finally, I'm not going to go through this universe in a strict chronological fashion in terms of internal continuity, but I'm also not going to quite go by real-world publishing chronology. What I'm going to do is go by the reading order I would recommend if you want to do an overall read-through of the entire Millerverse, but I will stress that each story arc, and each limited series that I mention works well enough by itself, and you should definitely not feel like you should slavishly read everything in a particular order just to follow it along. Again, in previous videos, I've talked about Type P readers, who are obsessed with finding the perfect reading order, and Type J readers, who are more relaxed. As ever, I believe you will have much more fun with comics if you are nearer to being a Type J reader, which is what I always personally try to do, despite my Type P tendencies. That said, at the end of this video, I am going to compare and contrast the 3 different ways you can approach reading the Millerverse. I'm going to compare the internal chronology with the chronology of real-world publication, and then my recommendation, which is a hybrid of the 2. All right, that's the preamble out of the way. Let's jump straight into it. Where does the Millerverse start? Let's start at the beginning with Batman Year 1. The Year 1 branding started with this story, and that's with the release of the story arc Batman Year 1, written by Frank Miller, illustrated by David Mazzucchelli in 1987. Now, the Miller story recounts Batman's first year as a crime fighter, as well as exploring the life of the recently transferred Gotham police detective James Gordon, and eventually builds towards their first encounter and their eventual alliance against Gotham's criminal underworld, which is really mainly sort of mafia and organized crime at this point. As such, it's a gritty, realistic telling of a superhero's first year operating as a hero. Now, the popularity of Frank Miller's work here inspired a whole slew of other creators to expand upon the Year 1 concept. I discussed these 23 other stories branded as Year 1 by DC Comics in my other videos. I have a whole playlist on that goes through all 157 single issues branded as Year 1, but I'm not going to diversion that here. So as mentioned previously, comic book story, published in 1987. It was actually published as 4 single issues in the ongoing series Batman. It was issues 404 to 407, making it an explicit story arc within an ongoing monthly series. There have been several reprints of this, which we'll talk about later. As I say, Batman's first year, Miller did something new with Batman by characterizing him as an average, inexperienced man trying to make a change rather than the formidable Bat God that we see in most Batman stories nowadays. To give you some examples, the very first time he goes out as a vigilante, he essentially gets his ass kicked as Batman underestimating his opponents, gets chased and shot at by police, and even trips over his own costume because it's too big. So the story's kept very street level and gritty, emphasizing kind of crime noir and realism. It's worth noting that this was published after Miller wrote Dark Knight Returns in 1986. We'll discuss that in a few minutes, but for now let's note that this story is chronologically the first one in the Millerverse, although it was published second. That's because the contract Miller signed to produce The Dark Knight Returns required him to also write a revamped Batman origin story, and so for Year 1 he just wrote the story and the script, and Mazzucchelli signed on to provide the artwork. Now, Year 1 was originally conceived as a graphic novel. However, it wasn't a graphic novel. Again, that's explained in my Vocabulary of Comics video if you're not sure of the difference. And was instead published as an explicit story arc in the ongoing series. The 4 issues had their own subtitles. Issue 404 was called Who I Am, How I Came to Be. Issue 405 is called War is Declared. Issue 406 is called Black Dawn. Issue 407 is called Friend in Need. Now, as the intention was to originally publish this as a single graphic novel and not 4 serialized installments, the art was intentionally done to take advantage of the rougher newsprint style paper used at the time. Now, this meant that the way this eventually got collected in glossy hardcovers and so on has proven to be quite problematic, and if you are a fan and you want to understand more about this, I'm afraid we've got to dive into this for a couple of minutes. Basically, in colouring the 1988 trade paperback, the colourist had to use a different colour palette in order to match the visual quality of the paper that was originally printed on. What this meant when it came to printing it is that DC have released a variety of different versions, which I'll talk through now. So DC released a hardcover and a paperback. These were deluxe editions of Year 1. That actually coincided with the Batman Begins movie in 2005. And those releases included introductions by Miller and Mazzucchelli, the original penciled artwork, and a bunch of other extras. New editions came out in 2012, but Mazzucchelli's gone on record to say he was unhappy with them, saying there were a few things that didn't follow his expectations in the way that the design was coloured and printed. In 2016, DC then released an absolute edition of Year One. I've got a picture here of a YouTube channel that's done an overview on, and I'll stick a link to them in the description below because they do a fantastic overview of it. This edition comes in a slipcase with 2 hardcover books. It's worth noting these 2 books are identical in terms of the story and the comic. Book 1 features a whole new scanning from the original sketches by Mazzucchelli with remastered colouring, whilst Book 2 is the same story, the same 4 issues again, but it just features scans using pages from the original Year 1 comic books that were released back in 1987. So essentially, you're getting 2 basically identical hardcovers. Whether or not this absolute edition is something that's worth it is something for you to think about yourself. So please do watch the overview before you pick it up if you're interested. There was then a 2017 deluxe edition, by the way, that was released with the same paper quality and colouring as the Absolute Edition Book 1, which was the remastered one. And so that's also available if you're interested. Finally, before we move on from Batman Year One, I should point out that in 2011, DC released an animated adaptation of this story. Now, it was produced by Bruce Timm, that's Tim with 2 M's, who is the Batman animated series guy. I haven't seen it. I gather it's quite good and a lot like Batman Year One. I've read Batman Year One and it's okay, but it's not brilliant in my opinion, and so I don't own it and I haven't gone out of my way to sort of pick it up. It's okay, and it's, you should definitely read it yourself and check out the hype. But that's where the Millerverse starts. Okay, moving on, we have Superman Year One. We are jumping ahead massively now in terms of when it was printed and published, because this is actually a DC Black Label story published in 2019. 3-issue limited series, starring Superman, written by Frank Miller and talking about Superman's Year One. Arguably his Year One anyway, because he doesn't even put the cape on at any point in this entire thing. The events described are described as happening on Earth 31, but again, please ignore that. I'm kind of sketchy in terms of whether that's the correct numbering. What I will say is, whilst it actually came out here, I would recommend. Whilst it actually came out in 2019, I would recommend reading it here in the read through if you're trying to read the Millerverse in one sequence. No harm if you don't, though. It doesn't really link into anything else. You can just read it by itself as a one shot, and that is fine. Next up, in a chronological read through, is Spawn Batman, which was actually published by Image Comics. It was written by Miller and drawn by Todd McFarlane. So this was an oversized one-shot with Miller's Batman battling and teaming up with the character of Spawn. It was released in 1994, and actually there were 2 Spawn Batman crossovers released in that year, but we'll talk about that in a second. So released in 1994, this was clearly set after Year One, but before the addition of Robin. It's interesting to read this and see the number of stylistic similarities between McFarlane's approach to Spawn with Miller's Dark Knight Returns. And it's interesting to kind of see how much Dark Knight Returns really influenced and shaped the nascent McFarlane style, the idea of talking heads and the framing and all that sort of stuff. It's really, really interesting. The funniest, by funniest I mean weirdest, aspect of this is the repeated use of the insult twit by Batman. He keeps on calling people twits. Which is weird. I guess like there were rules about what language he could use, but anyway. Otherwise, though, this is a story that's forgettable and very self-contained. It definitely leads more on the Image side of the shared universe than the DC side of this sort of crossover universe, because it's set in New York, and there is no New York in the DC universe, but there is one in the Image universe. I mentioned before that, and there was another Spawn Batman crossover in 1994. Please don't get that one confused with this one. I'll show you the cover to that one here. It's called Spawn Batman War Devil, published the same year, as I said, written by Doug Mensch, Alan Grant, and Chuck Dixon. I think I read it ages ago. I can remember nothing about it, but it doesn't matter. It's not written by Frank Miller. It's not part of the Millerverse at all. Also, FYI, I've literally just found out in the last few days that there's another Spawn Batman crossover planned for release in December 2022. But again, that doesn't involve Frank Miller, so we can basically ignore that. Okay, moving on, we have All-Star Batman and Robin the Boy Wonder. So All-Star Batman and Robin the Boy Wonder was an ongoing comic book that was launched in July 2005 and actually finished being published in, I think, 2008. It was written by Miller, drawn by Jim Lee, hence the amazing artwork. And it features a story set in the early stage of Batman's career, and it begins with his recruitment of Dick Grayson as Robin. It definitely shares a continuity of Miller's other Batman works, and I'm not going to talk about it too much here because I actually did a video dedicated to talking about this in a lot of detail on a separate playlist that I call Unpopular Comics It's Okay to Like, because it was basically utterly reviled, and I quite like it. So that video is available, and it's quite a lengthy deep dive. And actually, it's not one of these videos, a slideshow video. It's a Skycam video of me actually showing off my physical Absolute Edition, which I am very proud of and I very much enjoy. But this series was available as 10 single issues, or think about another way, it was a trade paperback collecting issues 1 to 9, or an Absolute Edition collecting all 10 issues. So if you are reading it, either pick it up as single issues and get all 10, or you need to pick up the trade for the first 9 and then track down issue 10 by itself. Or, and of course I would recommend this, pick up the Absolute Edition to get all 10 issues. The 10th issue is a bit of an oddity because essentially there's a whole kind of printing scandal and thing about it. Miller essentially stipulated during the production of the 10th issue that he had a whole bunch of swear words, which I'm going to kind of show them on screen because I found some pictures of them online and stuff. But there's some language in this which is obviously very offensive, and he said let's have this language on there and then let's cover it out with like little black boxes that sort of blurb it out. And it turns out that some of the printing didn't actually blurb it out, so it actually was printed with this very explicit dialogue, which I'm showing on screen here. So basically, it got withdrawn, they got pulped, and they had to get reprinted again, which wasn't really great for the series, and to be honest, was kind of the death knell of the series, because even up until that point, it was pretty much universally hated by critics. And I think with the whole hoo-ha around issue 10, it ended up getting cancelled before it had a chance to be completed, which means that it doesn't really have a clear, definitive ending per se. And with that, we come to The Dark Knight Returns. This is it. This is the seminal story. This is the one I guess everyone interested in to start with. The Dark Knight Returns was the first story that Frank Miller wrote off his Millerverse. Written by him with illustrations by him and Klaus Janson and Lynn Varley, and it came out in 1986. And this came out before year one, just before year one, in fact. It's a limited series set in a possible future that portrays Batman's last adventures, sort of. Obviously, there are sequels. And it depicts him as an old man coming out of retirement to be Batman. Now, I'm not going to go into the storyline because it's so famous in terms of his broad strokes, and if you don't know about it, I don't want to give you spoilers. But what I will point out is that this is often accused by people of giving birth and being kind of the herald to the era of grim and gritty comic books that really lasted from the late 80s through to the early 90s, when comic books really use a lot of adult-oriented themes like violence and sexual content. In the mid 90s, then it kind of changed to kind of just everything being like extreme and bombastic and explosive. But especially in the late 80s and early 90s, there was a really kind of dark theme that kind of went through the comics industry. And I'd say Dark Knight Returns was tremendously influential in terms of leading in that. The character here is portrayed as being kind of a dark and compulsive figure. And that really has influenced a lot of Batman projects ever since. I mean, gone was the idea of Batman 66 and the Adam West kind of goofy Batman. Ever since then, Batman's always been viewed as a bit of an intense, slightly psychotic, just really sort of brooding, dark, gritty kind of character. That said, within the context of the story, like it makes sense him to be like that. It's a direct result of him kind of overcompensating for just lots of things, like the trauma of losing his parents, his guilt over stopping to be Batman or failing to be Batman and still not having sort of saved Gotham, all that sort of stuff. And it kind of makes sense as a critique and really a damning indictment of Batman's psychology. I think all that's kind of well known, and so is the next thing I'm going to say, but sometimes it gets overlooked, which is that a key innovation here is the introduction of the antagonistic relationship between Batman and Superman. It's easy to overlook this now because we see this all the time, like the movies come out, Batman versus Superman, all these sorts of things. But the truth is that this is actually the first time it ever really happened in comics. Like the first time, like ever, this had really happened in comics. Up until then, they were always best buddies in everything they've ever been with, world's finest. Batman and Superman, the minute they meet, they're like best buddies and they had to like solve crime and fight evil together. This was the first time, like it actually showed that these two people had tension, they had beef, and not only was it unprecedented, it's worth pointing out that this is a plausible ideological conflict. We have Clark Kent as the Boy Scout and Bruce Wayne fundamentally as the criminal. We have Kent the idealist and we have Wayne the psychopath. We have what we're really seeing here is an underlying political conflict and tension between the concept of the benevolent authoritarianism that Superman is showing versus the individual libertarianism and anarchy that Bruce Wayne espouses. Now, I'm not going to get into this. I don't want to get into the whole pretentious thing, mainly because there are loads of videos out there on YouTube, I'm sure, that have done this much better than me. But it's just really interesting to consider this is the first time it ever happened, and it had a massive impact on their relationship, the two characters, ever since. However, it's also unfair to say that Miller's innovations were just limited just to things like that. His visual style was extremely bombastic and iconoclastic for the time. It lifted loads of stuff from movies, especially film noir. It changed the way that things were framed, contrasting smaller frames with larger frames and flipping from one to the other, using television talking heads as sort of like cutaways or soundbite pieces or excerpts. I mean, we're used to that from stuff like McFarlane's Spawn now and have been for decades, but actually, this was the first time it was done. As well as that, as well as having sort of an omniscient narrator, he also really dived into the POV or point of view and perspective of every single one of the main characters from their own sort of very skewed way of doing things. To be that Batman, Jim Gordon, Catwoman, etc., even the Joker. Now, the entire series has been collected in trade paperbacks, hardcovers, all sorts. I'll list them here. They're collected in the following things, roughly speaking. Trade paperback and hardcovers came out in '86. A 10th anniversary edition of each came out in '96. In 2002, another version came out. Absolute Edition came out in 2006, which we'll talk about more in a second because it's not alone in the Absolute Edition. You get a Noir Edition, and the Noir Edition is kind of like or just black and white. It's not pencil sketches. It's just the whole thing just without color because it's kind of film noir. That came out in 2015. Um, the 30th anniversary edition in 2016. There was a book with a Blu-ray and DVD set in 2016, a gallery edition in 2016, 2016 obviously being the 30th anniversary, and then a collector's edition hard. Basically, there are loads. There are loads that I haven't even thought of here. There are dozens and dozens of different variations of these, so you can pick them up in whatever format you like quite easily. One thing I'm going to point out here is that the animated movies, which you can see here, these are the covers, are from the DC animated universe. It adapts the Dark Knight Returns story into two full-length animated movies, and I'm going to just say this: these are hands down the best DC movies that have ever been made. Now, I know that's a bold thing to say, but as far as I'm concerned, this pair of movies as a whole is better than anything else done by DC ever. And this is, of course, just my opinion, obviously, but this is better than the Snyderverse. It's better than any of the movies that have come out recently. I enjoyed Aquaman and Shazam as much as the next person, but not as good as this. They're better than Batman 1989. They're better than the Donna Superman. These are literally they're far better than Christian Bale and Christian Bale and the Nolan Batman movies. They are exceptional. These animated movies are so good. I cannot stress it enough. They're just mind blowing. The skill and the sort of limpid attention to detail he's had as an adaptation of Dark Knight Returns is astonishing. I watched them with my partner who knows very little about comics. I had no idea what this was about. And after we watched them, she turned to me and she was like, "These are amazing." I said, yeah, they absolutely are phenomenal. So please, if there's one thing to take away from this video, is please go out and buy and watch these movies. They're brilliant. Okay, moving on. I'll be a bit quicker on this one. Dark Knight Strikes Again it's also referred to as DK2. It's a Batman miniseries by Frank Miller with Lynn Varley, and it's the sequel to the 1986 series Dark Knight Returns. 3 issues, a limited series, came out in 2001 to 2002. It's been collected into loads of different editions, and personally, I quite like it. A lot of people thought it wasn't very good and they should never have made it, but I think it's over time it's had a much more positive response now as people reflect on it. What I will point out is that this is the other half of the Absolute Dark Knight collection. So if you buy Absolute Dark Knight Returns as an absolute edition, it contains both the Dark Knight Returns and the Dark Knight Strikes Again. Because given the Dark Knight Returns is only 4 issues, Dark Knight Strikes Again is only 3 issues. So they put it together and it forms one duology, if you want to use that term, in an absolute edition. I have this. It's great. It's got loads of extras in it. If you are interested in picking up Dark Knight Returns, and if you don't mind Dark Knight Strikes Again, then definitely pick it up in this format. I would recommend reading Dark Knight Strikes Again first. I personally like it quite a lot, but I can see it's a lot rough around the edges, and it's definitely not as good as Dark Knight Returns, so I can see why it's coming for a lot of criticism. All right, moving on. Dark Knight 3, The Master Race. Okay, this is going to be a lot of pictures I'm showing on screen, and there's a lot of reasons why. Um, First things first, don't worry about the covers that I'm showing. I'm going to just run through all 9 issues and all 9 covers we have here. But one thing I will point out is that they're largely meaningless, because there's actually over 100 variant covers for Dark Knight 3, the Master Race, and they've actually been collected in their own hardcover called the Master Race Covers Gallery Edition or something like that, which I'll show you here. There you are. There it is. And so all these issues are available in that. Oh, sorry, all the covers are available, plus loads of others. So the covers don't really do much to kind of guide you. Instead, what I'm going to show you here actually are something cool they did at the same time when they released this 9 issue series back in 2016, 2017, is they actually released them in these cool little hardcover single issues. So each single issue had a hardcover variant that had these covers, which were awesome. I really thought they were nice. Um, just while I'm showing you these, what is the series? Well, it's originally scheduled to run for 8 issues, ended up being 9 issues. It was written by Frank Miller, sort of, but mainly by Brian Azzarello, to be honest. And it features art by Andy Kubert. And Kubert specifically drew it so it was in line with Miller's kind of previous art style. Like I say, it got released in 9 issues. Each of the issues had their own kind of like single hardcover paperback version. This is back when I used to actually physically go to an LCS. I would go there and I would go to my local comic book shop and I would pick them up. And I was really enjoyed picking up these single hardcover volumes with this like awesome pencil artwork on there. So that was kind of cool. Unfortunately, I no longer have them, but that's one way you can collect this if you want. Another thing to keep in mind is that each of the 9 issues actually had a smaller issue stapled inside it. That sounds weird. So what I mean is you have the normal full-size issue, and then right in the middle of it, where the staples are for like the middle page, what happened is they actually include like a little pamphlet-sized, half-size, smaller issue inside that in the single issue, which admittedly was a bit odd. So these are the 9 issues I'm showing you here, and they're in this order. So you have the Dark Knight Universe presents the Atom, Dark Knight Universe presents Wonder Woman. The next one's Green Lantern. In issue 4, you had Batgirl. In issue 5, you had Lara. I'm not going to say who Lara is because I guess it's a spoiler if you haven't read it already. In issue 6, you have World's Finest. Issue 7 was Strange Adventures. Issue 8 was Detective Comics. And issue 9 was the Dark Knight Universe Presents Action Comics. So those were in all the single 9 issues. Now, if you read all this 9 single issues rather than getting the Absolute Edition, don't worry, you don't have to read it in any kind of weird order, just read them as they come. Here's an image of the contents page from the Absolute Edition, and it kind of indicates like the issue you read and then the little smaller bonus issue inside, and then you read the next issue and the smaller bonus issue, and so on and so forth. This isn't my picture of the Absolute Edition, I grabbed this from YouTube, but I do want the Absolute Edition one day. Having said that, I'm waiting for it to be on sale because, in my opinion, the story's mediocre and the ending is a bullshit thing that I was not impressed about, and one day I'll do a separate video on. But yeah, that's Dark Knight 3. Quite a lot to cover on that. I hope that made sense. Speaking of the Absolute Edition, here we have a one-shot called The Dark Knight Returns: The Last Crusade. This also came out in June 2016, so it came out whilst Dark Knight 3: The Master Race was being released. It came out literally, I think, after issue 5, I want to say, before issue 6. Totally random. This is a one-shot, published in a prestige format, and it's actually a prequel to the 1986 series Dark Knight Returns. Having said that, I would strongly recommend reading it here after Dark Knight 3. It doesn't contain spoilers for Dark Knight Returns or for its sequels. Um, and in terms of internal chronology, like I said, it's set before Dark Knight Returns, but it just feels right reading this here. And whoever put the absolutes together also seemed to agree with me because they also put The Last Crusade at the end of Dark Knight 3: The Master Race. Cool. And then almost finally, we have The Dark Knight Returns: The Golden Child. Now, Golden Child is a one-shot. It came out in DC Black Label randomly in December 2019, and it's referring to the Golden Child being John Kent. And I'll be frank, it's a very muddled story about him and his sister Lara facing off against Joker and Darkseid whilst Carrie is the new Batman and stuff. It also has this weird, kind of very laboured backstory about politics and Trump's re-election and stuff. And the artwork, at least the artwork for John Kent, is just fucking hideous. It's not collected anywhere. It's not in the Absolute Edition or anything. I really wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but if you do a comprehensive read through, this is the last Dark Knight Returns or Millerverse comic, both in terms of when it was published and in terms of when it was set. So there we have it. All right, cool. That's 36 issues in total. But before we go any further, I do need to do a special mention, and that's for a comic called Holy Terror. Now, Holy Terror, please, by the way, don't confuse this with the Elseworlds one shot from the 80s that I'm showing you a picture of here. That's a completely separate comic. The Holy Terror we're talking about is a 2011 graphic novel by Frank Miller, which follows a costumed vigilante called the Fixer as he battles Islamic terrorists who would make an attack on his city, Empire City, which is kind of depicted as being a bit like New York and a bit like Basin City from Sin City. The reason I'm including it here is because a lot of people get confused about this. This graphic novel was originally proposed as Holy Terror Batman in 2006, and that's when it was going to come out. But eventually, Miller decided to change it to not starring Batman, instead starring someone not dissimilar called The Fixer, and publishing it outside DC. It was actually eventually published by Legendary Comics. I'll be honest, I didn't know Legendary Comics existed. I'd only ever heard of their film division, so there we are. The story itself was critically panned, and everyone basically universally hated it. A few points to note here that I'll just throw out just so you know in case you are interested in checking it out. It's not really part of the Millerverse, although I guess it was originally intended to be, but since then it's pivoted and has an original character. It's much more like Sin City in style, tone, and art than anything else in the Millerverse. The first half of it, please keep the comments section civil with your responses to this, but the first half of it actually isn't terrible. I'd say the first half or third is okay-ish, although frankly it's a weaker version of the Judd Winnick Catwoman opening issue from the New 52, which essentially had the same theme and the same kind of dynamic, but it's just done much better. But in that sense, the first half's not, utterly terrible. About halfway through, it declines steeply in quality and does end up being completely terrible by the end, in my opinion. I will point out that's not because I think it's Islamophobic or racist. It's a little bit of both, I suppose, but mainly it's just crude, dated, and clumsy. And it's just not a pleasant reading experience. Speaking of which, of the reading experience, the entire comic is landscape, much like Miller's previous comic, 300. So just be aware of that if you pick it up. Okay, and that was Holy Terror. And that takes us to the end of the Millerverse. As I mentioned right at the beginning of this video, I'm also going to give you an idea of how I would map these in terms of their three particular ways. And to that end, I am going to show you this slide. So what we have on this slide is on the left, we have them in terms of, I guess, if you want to call it that, we have this in terms of publishing chronology. So we have the Dark Knight Returns. The year later, Batman Year One came out. We then have Spawn. We then have Dark Knight Strikes Back came out. We then have AllStar Batman and Robin came out. Holy Terror came out in 2011, although it wasn't part of DC. We then had Dark Knight 3. Simultaneous to that, we had Last Crusade. We then had Superman come out. And right at the bottom, we have The Golden Child. And that's in terms of when it was actually sort of published in the physical, real world. That's on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, we have the internal chronology of stories, which is Year One, then Superman Year One, Spawn Batman, All-Star Batman and Robin. Then The Last Crusade is set several decades after that, but a couple of decades or a decade before Dark Knight Returns. After Dark Knight Returns, we have Dark Knight Strike Back, Dark Knight Master Race, and then The Golden Child. And then Holy Terror off to one side because it's random. So on the left, we've got the chronology in the real world, how it was published. On the right, we have the chronology of what it's set like in the comic. In the middle, we have what I'm going to call the Thomas Judge reading order, which is basically the same as the internal chronology. The only difference is I would put The Last Crusade after Dark Knight 3. That's how it's collected in the absolute, and personally I think it gives for a slightly more fulfilling reading it in that sequence. That's purely a personal thing. Otherwise, it's basically exactly the same as the internal one that you can see on the right. All right, feel free to freeze frame this and pause it and screenshot it, whatever you want to do, if you want to make a note of that. Hopefully that's helpful, but we're not quite done yet. As I mentioned right at the beginning, whilst doing this reading guide, I realised that there are around 86 other single issues that people on the internet and at DC, often considered to be part of the Dark Knight's Return universe. And to give you an idea of what I mean, consider it like this. This is a diagram that I put together specifically to show you what I mean. You got the Millerverse in the middle, which is 36 issues, and then you have a whole extended universe around it, not written by Frank Miller, but in theory, set in the Dark Knight universe, set in the same universe. Sometimes that's because that's what people say, sometimes it's explicit within the comic itself, and sometimes it's what DC editorial have said. So trying to get a whole reading list for the whole Dark Knight universe is a lot bigger than just Miller. But Miller is a very self-contained bit right in the middle. Outside the extended Dark Knight universe, you've got loads and loads of issues. You've got the rest of DC, basically, but let's not talk about that here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover the stories in that middle bit, in the extended Dark Knight universe, in a later video. And I'm going to do that in about a week or so. I'll have a different thumbnail, I'll have a different title, but it'll be very clear what it is. The reason I'm splitting this up is, one, this video is now incredibly long, but also, before I talk about that, I need to actually drop a vocabulary of comics video on a concept called retrospective recontextualization. I know that sounds very technical, but it'll all be explained in the next video, which is useful to understand it in order for an overview of the extended Dark Knight Returns universe to really make sense and for you to understand some of the points that I'm going to make about that. So with that out of the way, I'm kind of teasing the next few videos in this. That, ladies, gentlemen, and others, is the end of this overview of the Millerverse and the expanded Dark Knight Returns universe teased for next time. Hopefully, that's been useful. All right, thanks for watching, everybody. As always, please like, comment, subscribe. As always, please follow me on Twitter at @IamThomasJudge, where I will post a daily review of whatever comics I've been reading. You can get an idea of what I'm up to on the channel. And as always, please support the channel by heading over to Amazon.com and checking out my prose novel about superheroes. It's a completely original piece of work. The first episode in it is called Arrivals, and the series as a whole is called No Gods or Kings. You can find an excerpt of that on my website, nogodsorkings.com. Until next time, everybody, stay classy.